In this talk, I want to look at the question of prohibited sexual relations with kin, namely incest, and also the question of adultery. In these two areas, particularly in that of incest, we come up against some of the most general and powerful theories in anthropology, an area which is of great interest because in incest one finds that intersection between marriage, sex, and kinship, which illustrates many of the themes I've talked about. We need to distinguish between rules of outmarriage, exogamy, and rules of outbreeding or sexual relations, incest. Incest comes from the Portuguese word which literally means unchaste, but in fact it's to do with sexual relations with kin. Defined by Robin Fox as sexual intercourse between individuals related in certain prohibited degrees of kinship. Now, why has the subject aroused so much interest among anthropologists? It's attracted, in fact, many of the greatest names in anthropology and psychology, of course Freud, and later Malinowski and Levi-Strauss. One of the reasons is that here at last we seem to have found something that is universal, a taboo that is universal. We were attempting to do that with marriage, we were attempting to do it with the nuclear family. Neither of these things did we find universal, but at last we seem to have found something that covers all human societies. Malinowski therefore wrote, "It is an axiom of anthropology that nothing arouses a greater horror than the breach of that prohibition." And Radcliffe Brown wrote, "In human societies generally, such conduct is regarded as unthinkable, something that could not possibly occur, and the idea of it arouses a strong emotional reaction of repugnance, disgust, or horror." And Louis Dumont writes, "The prohibition of incest is recognized as universal. It is seen as a basic condition of social life. Not only does it appear to be universal, but it also appears to be specifically human." Thus, Schuski writes, "One fact about incest is certain. It is uniquely human. No other primates have such a norm." The argument, if one accepts these premises, and as we'll see there is some doubt about them, the argument is as follows in the work particularly of Levi-Strauss. The horror and taboo of incest within the elementary family, particularly between brothers and sisters and parents and children, is universal in human societies. Hence, you have forbidden the obvious mating relationship, that is between a brother and a sister, or between parents and children. Hence, you have to look outside the nuclear family. If there wasn't this taboo, of course, everyone would mate with the nearest person. You have to look outside, and outmarriage sets up the whole system of kinship and marriage, which is the basis of social organization in many societies. Furthermore, the conflict between the desire, an implicit desire to actually have to mate with a very close relative, and the rules that you may not do so, generate the psychological and cultural features in which we are interested. They set up the whole social system upon which human societies are based. Hence, as Levi-Strauss puts it, if social organization had a beginning, this could only have consisted in the incest prohibition. It is there, and only there, that we find a passage from nature to culture, from animal to human life. And when words like nature and culture are used by anthropologists, they have a very deep meaning. The natural things are prohibited, and therefore we have the whole erection of rules, language, cultural systems. But let's look a bit more closely at the premises before we discuss the theories. Firstly, is this unique to man? Well, there has been a good deal of discussion, and recent investigation of some of the primates suggests that, in fact, some of these species, in fact, do have prohibitions on close mating, whether you can call it an incest taboo, in the sense that it's not actually something about which the culture is aware, is questionable, but there are clearly prohibitions on close mating between certain species, both of ducks, as Lawrence showed, and also some of the primates. Therefore, it may not be a specifically human characteristic. Secondly, there is the question of a universal horror and taboo. We ourselves, in our own society, haven't characteristically had a great horror of this subject, unlike the masturbation and bestiality taboos I've talked about. Incest, historically in Western societies, has been treated moderately lightly. It wasn't an offence for which you were heavily punished, and when it occurred, people don't seem to have been regarded with that absolute horror that one finds with these other offences. And this is the case in a number of simpler societies as well. Among the mountain Arapesh of New Guinea, for example, Margaret Mead recounts how the natives didn't even have a word for anything that approached incest. They had no awareness of what the term meant. It had to be explained to them what the anthropologist was looking for. Among the Talensi, studied by Maya Fortes, you find that brother-sister and father-daughter incest was treated with complete scorn, and they couldn't really believe that this sort of thing occurred. There was incredulity. Among the Pondo of South Africa, as in many societies, there's what is much more common, which is a combination of an oral tradition that if incest occurs, then we would be horrified and we would outlaw the people and we would stone them to death and they would be so ashamed, with a much milder attitude to actual cases. The two most extreme cases that anthropologists have often cited of an incest taboo and horror are the Apache Indians and the Trobriand Islands. But if you in fact look at these and the actual treatment of incest cases, again you find that the treatment is much lighter than the supposed general attitude. For example, Malinowski, writing about the Trobriands, writes that in spite of the seemingly absolute taboo, in spite of real and overwhelming abhorrence felt by the natives, cases of brother-sister incest do yet actually occur, and when they do, nothing happens. Father-daughter incest also occurs. They are universally known, but they were spoken of with great discretion and never before the people concerned. Well, an attitude in which you are so discreet in front of the people suggests something less than that horror about which anthropologists seem to be agreed. Of course, it's true that in the Oedipus, the most famous myth of incest, the Oedipus myth, there you find horror and the gods are angry, and you find such myths in traditional China and elsewhere. But in practice, there is a much more relaxed attitude, and indeed recent work on classical or ancient Egypt suggests that you may get quite high rates of brother-sister marriage, thus breaking that incest taboo, in a society institutionalized. There have been before cases recorded of the nobility and the aristocracy who had allowed such marriages. But widespread brother-sister marriage has been now found in in ancient Egypt, and in this case it doesn't seem to have been tabooed. And indeed, it's been suggested that incest is something which, and the fears of incest, is something which has been somewhat inflated both by anthropologists and also by psychologists following Freud's lead. Kinsey found that the incidence of incest was not as great as he had expected, and in fact he remarked rather dryly, incest occurs more frequently in the thinking of clinicians and social workers than it does in actual performance. The situation now is very muddled because in fact recently there's been a lot of work on incest in European families and surprisingly high rates of incidence. It's a subject which is now being talked about in a way that it wasn't some time back, and in fact there clearly are quite serious cases of incest occurring in Western society. But assuming that it is a widespread fear and taboo, even not, if not perhaps universal in the usual sense, what are the theories that have been put forward to account for this widespread taboo? Well, there's been a great deal of discussion and perhaps I can run through just one or two of the major theories. One of them was that put forward by Freud, and basically his theory in Totem and Taboo and elsewhere was that the incest taboo is the result of suppressed desire. You do desire to have sexual relations with a close relative, with your mother, for example, if you're a son, with your father if you're a daughter, and vice versa. But particularly in the case of a son desiring the mother, you get a conflict of authority and access. The father suppresses the son's chances here. The stern father intervenes and stops this challenge to his rights in his mate. And so the incest taboo emerges, and you have this repressed sexuality, which is right at the heart of our family system. As various people have pointed out, there are basic flaws in this as a universal theory of why incest occurs. For example, it doesn't explain sibling incest. There's no reason why a father should be particularly concerned about brothers and, or his children having incestuous relations. And it doesn't explain often incest taboos on wider kin outside the nuclear family. Nor, as Malinowski in a famous book pointed out, does it explain the patterns in matrilineal societies. Freud was writing basically about patriarchal Austrian families where you had a stern father repressing his son. But in matrilineal societies, the Trobrands, for example, that Malinowski studied, there was no stern father to intervene. The important person in a child's life, of a male of a superior generation, was the mother's brother, and therefore you didn't have the straight Oedipal conflicts there. A second theory, put forward by the anthropologist Westermarck, was that incest is biologically harmful. Close mating is biologically harmful, and therefore societies will avoid it for various reasons. This has cropped up again and again. More recently, David Abele, for example, resurrected the Theonian evolutionism, is that incest is genetically harmful and natural selection does the rest. Societies which have allowed such close mating have died out, and we don't know anything about them. But in fact, there are, again, questions about this. The general agreement seems to be that close intermating doesn't necessarily have harmful genetic effects. What it tends to do is emphasize whatever the genetic structure is. So that, for example, among mountaineers in Kentucky, in some valleys where there have been very close intermarriage over a long period, you find that the people were consistently more intelligent, more physically able than in the average American population. In others, the whole place was filled with those with webbed feet and cleft palates and low intelligence and so on, that it tended to stress genetic features of the society. So it's not clear that this argument will explain incest taboos. A second theory put forward by Westermarck was that close physical proximity gives rise to instinctive aversion. As he put it, generally speaking, there is a remarkable absence of erotic feelings between persons living very close together from childhood. Inverting it, absence makes the heart grow fonder, and presence makes the heart grow less fond if you are actually living with someone closely and if you're brought up with someone. Something about being brought up closely with someone actually prevents you from actually sexually desiring them. This theory has also been resurrected by Robin Fox, who puts it as following: the more intensive the bodily interaction between opposite-sex children during sexual immaturity, the more likely the possibility that they will voluntarily abstain from sexual relations with each other after puberty. So that, in fact, you don't need a very strong incest taboo. This thesis has also been suggested for explaining why there appear to be quite strong incest taboos of a kind on kibbutzim, for example, in Israel, where children are brought up together, and often you don't find them actually wanting to mate or to get married, and they marry outside the kibbutz in which they were brought up. It's also been suggested that in Taiwan, where a child is adopted in, a young son is adopted in, for example, it's unlikely that that son will want to marry the girl who he can, of course, marry because he's from another family, who is his half-sister. And when the marriages do occur, it's been suggested that the fertility is much lower because the desire has been minimized. In a sense, you treat them as brothers and sisters and you don't feel that sexual relationship towards them. There are problems about that explanation, though it has a certain attractiveness. One of them is that if that theory always subsisted, it's difficult to see how marriages would be very effective, because of course you live with a person for 20 years, and if the presence made the heart grow less fond, presumably after a very short time the desire would dry up. You could counter that, of course, in various ways, but there is not necessarily an inhibition created by being close to someone. There are other difficulties as well, one of them being that if in fact we don't desire people who are close to us, why do we have this taboo? The very presence of a cultural rule of this strength and a horror of this kind suggests that we do actually need a rule to prevent something which we appear to desire. Another thesis that's been put forward is that, rather similar to the evolutionary one, is that demographic constraints in early societies, the fact that you couldn't actually mate with someone of a senior generation because they probably died because of the high mortality rates, meant that this never occurred in early societies, and as a result a taboo grew up. Again, there are difficulties with that. Finally, there's the argument, rather similar to the early argument I mentioned, which is that in fact the social system is such that there will be all sorts of confusions and conflicts if you allow such mating, conflicts of authority between the generations. It'll mess up the kinship system, and as a result society forbids it. Perhaps we can finally turn to the last matter of sexual behavior, which is adultery. Adultery is defined in all sorts of different ways in different societies, and the attitude varies. The basic contrast is between those societies which treat it as an offence between individuals and those which treat it as a form of theft of rights. In our own society in the past, there tends to have been a double standard, as it's called, in the treatment of adultery. Adultery by women was a terrible offence because, as Dr. Johnson put it, it confused progeny. It made it difficult to know whose children the woman was bearing, whereas adultery by a man was not such a serious offence. In the post-contraceptive age, of course, these difficulties disappear, and again the incidence suggests that this is a very widespread offence. Kinsey suggests that perhaps over half of married males have had intercourse during marriage with others, and the rates are indeed very high. And the attitude in our society may be changing. At this point, I would like to end talking about sexual behaviour and move on to consider wider themes in kinship and marriage.